Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again with another book review, yay! Today we're stepping away from my typical fantasy genre to review something I read for book club, Kristin Hannah's extremely popular novel Nightingale, first published in 2016. I'll start off, as always, spoiler-free, and then I'll warn you when I dip into the spoiler section. So, this book opens with a fun framing device typical of historical fiction, wherein an older woman is going through her attic, stumbles upon an old box with stuff from a time she hadn't thought of in a while. Her son finds her. He's like, "Come on, Mom, it's not safe for you to be climbing around up here in the attic on your own. Oh, what's all this stuff here? What are these names? What are these documents? Where are those from? You never told me anything about this." And so then we're thrust back into the late 1930s in France, starting off in the fictional town of Cerveau, just outside of Paris. The year is 1939, and there are rumors of another big war on the horizon because of that madman Hitler. Now, while the setup is pretty standard for this type of novel, what Hannah does with it is quite unique. She introduces us to a 29-year-old woman named Vianne, who at first we think might be that narrator, that lady from the 1995 framing intro, but then we're also introduced to Vianne's sister, Isabelle, 10 years younger, and living not in Cerveau, but in Paris. So pretty quickly here we get this parallel story of these two somewhat estranged and kind of passive-aggressive sisters on the brink of World War II. And which one will wind up being the older woman from the beginning? Let's read and find out. So, Kristin Hannah then takes readers on the harrowing adventures and survival efforts of both sisters living through Nazi-occupied France during World War II. They both have different priorities for what it means to resist and what it means and what is necessary to survive through such harrowing times. With one sister, Hannah explores more active and covert resistance efforts to rescue downed French, American, Canadian airmen. And the other sister, in fact, the sister's half of the story that I felt was most powerful and most beautifully portrayed. This sister struggles with a much less grand, but in my opinion, far more fascinating struggle to protect her family with soldiers and officers billeting at her home and with having to take care of small children despite the food shortages. Just as a small example of the difficult things that sister has to deal with. Questions of what it means when a German soldier shows random acts of kindness, but he may still be a monster, or worse yet, that he's not a monster, and that it's only monsters, or that it's not only monsters capable of inflicting such horror, but actual other human beings who betray their humanity over and over again, making it all the more terrifying that they're capable of supporting, fighting for, and imposing laws of such a horrible, monstrous regime. Fascinating questions, all important to consider, especially, I think, when we look at historical fiction during World War II. One of the sister storylines also deals much more heavily with the specific persecution of France's Jewish population. Without giving too much away, Hannah also takes the time to give a fairly accurate representation of what a concentration camp was like, what a death march was like, and the pain and sickness and struggle to survive in such a place. There's also stuff in here about suffering through and surviving sexual assault. Really powerful stuff, and I think Hannah handled it all extremely well, using these intense and horrible events not gratuitously for shock value or to sensationalize, but instead as a way to explore deeper themes about suffering, survival, and really continue a great conversation about gender-specific suffering and survival. So hats off to Hannah for all of that. Now, before going to spoilers, I'll give a generic star rating. 4 stars easily, as in it's 4 stars, but I could see myself giving it 5 on a good day. It only gets knocked down a star for 2 reasons. One, the storyline that a summary might suggest is the more exciting and adventurous. Throughout those sections, roughly half the book, as good as they were, for the most part, I just kept wanting to get back to the other sister story. So I fear Hannah failed to hold my interest there as much as I would have liked. Again, though, both halves of the story are very well done. And the other thing that kind of knocks it down. And some might say it's a bit of a nitpick. I won't get too specific, but there is a sequence near the end of the book extremely reminiscent of a scene in Spielberg's Schindler's List. Now, we don't know if Hannah was intentionally referencing the scene in that film, or maybe she read one of the same memoirs or letters that Spielberg read, and they were both inspired kind of separately to include the same type of scene. But back with Spielberg's film in '93, that scene in question raised some debate for how appropriate it was to build suspense around and have a bit of a twist around, around what's being depicted. So again, now, regardless of whether or not Hannah knew how closely she was following that scene, her inclusion of it here raises a lot of the same questions and potential for debate. But still, this doesn't hurt the book that much. It just made for a bit of an awkward reading experience for that scene, and not intentionally, I think, like with the atrocities that Hannah depicts when she's really trying to get us into that kind of uncomfortable headspace. If there's going to be a scene that's a rehash of something from Schindler's List, though, I will say that it's probably better that it's a conversation starter as opposed to something more inconsequential, so I'll give her that. Okay, so if you've watched up to this point and haven't read this book, thank you for watching. If any of that sounds interesting, and if you're interested in this time period or historical fiction, survival efforts of specifically women during World War II, I highly recommend you go check this book out, give it a read. But now we're going to go into spoilers. In this section, let's talk about the two sisters separately. Isabel first. Isabel is adventurous, flirty, rebellious, so of course when the war breaks out, she is all about helping resistance movements in any way she can. She feels like her sister isn't doing enough to resist. Her sister feels like Isabel isn't doing enough to be careful and keep the family safe, so they go their separate ways. Isabel moves back to Paris, getting more and more involved with resistance efforts, until she's literally leading downed ally airmen south across the Pyrenees into Spain. Adventurous, daring, and exciting stuff. Only I was never particularly excited by those sequences. I did like that through the Isabel character, we got to see more of Paris at this time. I like the constant paranoia and all of the strenuous efforts everyone made to cover their tracks. And then, because when it comes to World War II history, I've studied specifically the Holocaust more than anything else. So Isabel being sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and the death march afterwards, and just how painfully and horrifically all of that was depicted, up through Isabel's release, her struggle with health and ultimate death, displaying how you can't really just count up the dead at the camps. Many prisoners died afterwards because of health complications and what was done to them. But that whole final stretch of Isabel's storyline was the most gripping and distressing, and I think the most important, really, that Hannah wrote with Isabel. Yeah, it's fine to show her joking around with the loud and arrogant Yanks and Brits and the daring adventure across the Pyrenees and how exhausting and death-defying the whole thing was. But during those adventurous sections, you can't ever, the readers, thinking about this time period, I don't think we can ever really escape the fact that these horrors, these concentration camp and mass murder horrors are happening simultaneously. So I'm glad Hannah went this route, showing us how unfortunately so many of these resistance fighters were rounded up, and if not executed, then sent to these camps. Now, two things in the end that really lost me a bit. One, the Schindler's List scene I mentioned above. Since we're in spoilers here, I'll describe it more detailed. This is when the women on Isabel's train, they all arrive at Ravensbrück and they're being herded towards these barracks, stripped, brutally shaved, and then all violently ushered into a shower room. And I don't think there's any mistake about what Hannah was trying to pull off here, trying to set this up as extremely suspenseful, all of us readers thinking it might be them being put into a gas chamber and about to die. Because Isabel's inner monologue references that they knew about the gas chambers at other camps, and she has this thought just a few paragraphs before they're put in the shower room. So of course, then I guess the trick is that it's a merciful relief and twist of sorts when there's actual shower heads and water coming out of them. But it's really kind of just so weird to me that this exact bait and switch happens in Schindler's List. So a bit of the tension and drama was lost in that scene there for anyone who's seen the movie. And then there's the debate about whether writers or filmmakers should use a scenario like this to build tension and then get us to a satisfying twist. It's sort of like we, the audience, get this great relief and jolt of happiness and excitement that feels a bit dishonest. And while I'm sure they gave the laboring prisoners showers, and that this sort of thing did happen, it can come off feeling a bit inappropriate used in this dramatic way when the vast majority of these instances and similar scenes it ended much more horrifically. It's almost like Hannah is sparing us the pain of witnessing that, which feels especially off considering how boldly and purposefully and brilliantly, I think, she forces us to witness so much else of the pain and the atrocities going on at this time. Sorry for that little tangent, but that's my little aside about that scene. And that's just one of the problems I had with the end of Isabel's story. Now, bridging the shower scene and my other issue, I actually really enjoyed this part. Of course, enjoy is probably the wrong word, but it's clear Hannah consulted and researched as many testimonies, memoirs, and so on that she could to get a clear idea of what was going through these women's minds as prisoners in these camps, the types of labor, the types of cruelty, the disease, and the unsanitary conditions, the sort of mental exercises, and what they had to think about to just make it another day. Painful as it all is to read, I'm so thankful Hannah didn't shy away from showing us that. Now, then we move on to Isabel's final moments. She's terminally ill. It's not looking good. The readers, we've all pretty much started assuming the narrator is more likely Vianne and not Isabel. And even though the war ends and Isabel is returned to her family, her health continues to decline. And then in her final moments, she's reunited with her wartime lover, Gaetan, and she gets one final goodbye with him before dying. I never really felt like their romance was particularly compelling, and as far as dynamics between different characters, I feel that Hannah had not built up the hope in me that Isabel would eventually be reunited with Gaetan. It seemed like the peaceful and happy ending for Isabel kind of already happened at that point, her being reunited with her sister, and the two of them reconciling, and at last understanding their two very different but equally powerful and important efforts to resist and survive. That was so satisfying that we really didn't need to see Isabel reunited with a boy it seemed like she loved. Sure, we were told that, but only really got a couple dozen pages with that romance during the book. In conclusion, Isabel's story was compelling enough, but a few pacing and tonal missteps and emotional focus issues distracted from me totally enjoying her story as much as her sister's. Now moving on to Vianne. We have a 29 to 35-year-old woman living in a small town in France. I think Hannah really did something special here. She gave us small little instances of these potentially life-changing and gut-wrenching decision points for Vianne all throughout this story. Vianne is a mother trying to protect her daughter Sophie, but she's also very quickly a wife without a husband who she's been with half of her life, who's helped her through several difficult stretches of time, death of parents, miscarriages, and so on. And he quickly becomes a prisoner of war, not to be seen for years, or at least not to be seen until the last couple of chapters. So as the Nazis roll into town, Vianne, the single mother, has to keep one eye on her community and friends, trying to protect them, but also be more cautious around them. And she has to keep another eye on her daughter, who no matter what, no matter how much someone thinks people should have fought harder or resisted the Nazis more, we can't take this away from Vianne. She needs to do what she needs to do to keep her daughter fed and well taken care of. And I feel just horrible, but I think in the right amount and the right way that Hannah was going for. I feel horrible whenever Vianne and Isabel have their disagreements about resistance efforts, and even though I understand Isabel's motives, I can't help but feel abandoned along with Vianne when her sister leaves and goes back to Paris. Now, let's talk about some of the more difficult stuff. First, the two Nazis who wind up billeting at Vianne's house. The first guy, Officer Beck, he's a Wehrmacht officer, seemingly at first just a conquering soldier, needing a place to live, trying to be as little of a nuisance for Vianne and Sophie as possible. Sure, he can be a bit demanding. She has to cook for him sometimes. And just from the get-go, having the enemy live with you, it's a total invasion and offense to have him living there under her roof. But Beck does try to be polite, and he even gets some correspondence started between Vianne and her imprisoned husband, and Antoine. Vianne also gets to eat maybe just a little bit better since he's living there, but she, of course, has to deal with all of the nasty rumors around town about what she's doing for this officer. Now, one of my favorite chapters is when Vianne goes to Beck's office in town. Up to this point, she started to see much more of his humanity, how helpful, kind, and respectful he can be, and I admit I was starting to worry about the direction Hannah was taking Beck's storyline. Was she actually going to try to make us sympathize and root for Beck in any kind of way? If so, that would have made me extremely uncomfortable. Beck does serve the German military and the Nazi regime, and as much as people like him might have said afterwards they were just following orders, by and large, people fighting for a nation or fighting and working for a government spitting out such violent and hateful rhetoric, orders or no, those people tended to agree, and still do, tend to agree with the goals of their nation, at least in some way. So this is why I love the scene when Vianne goes to his office. She started to kind of think he's not so bad, but she sees him sitting there with piles of food all around while most of the French population in town are starving. And, of course, he has a massive portrait of Hitler hanging behind him. As disarming, charismatic, and helpful as Beck can be at times, this image never leaves Vianne's head or the readers' heads as an example of the evil that Beck still ultimately serves. Even though his kindness persists to the point of helping Vianne to help her Jewish friend and neighbor Rachel, I am ultimately glad that she is eventually forced to kill him by smashing a shovel into the back of his head. Unfortunately, though, that leads to the more abusive and horrifying, I believe it's an SS officer, von Richter, staying with Vianne, getting wise to the fact that Vianne's adopted son, Daniel, is actually probably not her son, probably a Jewish refugee, and maybe even to the fact that she's working with the church to save other Jewish children from deportation by sending them to an orphanage. All very exciting yet subtle efforts of resistance that, again, I was more interested in than Isabel's hikes across the Pyrenees, as impressive as that is. But since von Richter probably knows some of what Vianne's hiding, he uses this against her, and he rapes her until the end of his stay there, almost up to the end of the war. And I like that the child he leaves her pregnant with. I like how difficult it is for Vianne to talk about this and to think about it, how she struggles and ultimately can't communicate that to her husband when he comes back. And even then, that the son of hers that we meet throughout kind of the framing 1995 timeline, that he is the product of this rape. And then Vianne still, even as old as she is by the end, she's still stuck in this horrible world left by what the Nazis did, this world where she has to keep making these horrible and difficult choices, in this case, and on one of the book's final pages, the choice to lie to her son about the truth of his conception, something that I don't think any of us can really pass much judgment on unless we've been in a similar situation. Even then, everybody's going to be a little bit different there. But now, let's back up to my favorite part of Vianne's story. When the kind officer Beck is still alive, he politely and inoffensively asks her to write a list for him of communists, homosexuals, and Jews in the town. She agrees, at first leaving off the name of her friend Rachel, but Beck asks her if she just forgot to put Rachel's name on the list, indicating he already has an idea of the names that he's asking for. So she writes her friend's name, not yet realizing the full weight of this. Pretty soon, though, she becomes more and more aware of how horrible it was of her to be so complicit in this. I love Hannah showing us how Vianne is dealing with her guilt and how she's so wrecked with guilt over this list that she helped with. So Vianne begs her friend for forgiveness, offers support, they remain friendly, and then the deportations begin. Beck tries to warn Rachel and Vianne because he's still alive and living with them at this time. And Beck asks Vianne to try to sneak Rachel out of town before she's deported. And in a shocking and horrific moment, when they're crossing the border into Vichy, France, Sophie's friend and Rachel's daughter, Sarah, is killed in a spray of bullets when some of the border patrol open fire on the crowd. And then Vianne takes Rachel and Ari back home, hides them, but they're found anyway. And Rachel gives Ari, in one kind of final desperate act, Rachel gives Ari to Vianne to protect him as Rachel's forced away off onto a train. Here's one of those instances when Beck is still around and helpful. He goes through the risk and troubles of forging false papers and IDs for Ari, making him Daniel, an adopted son of Vianne and Antoine's, adopted right before the war with no Jewish blood. And so this just kind of triples Vianne's burden, but also her courage, the secret she's keeping, the lives she's protecting. I love the Vianne character. Her storyline single-handedly makes this one of the best books I've read so far this year. I had heard that this was a real tearjerker, and I was kind of waiting to see exactly what parts of the story got me the most emotional. I enjoy a good cry over, good literature, good movies every once in a while. And there's several gut-wrenching tear-jerking moments, to be sure. For example, the death of Rachel's daughter, Sarah, that I just mentioned, or a moment in which their father sacrifices himself pretending to be the Nightingale to try to save Isabel. Then there's the entirety of what Isabel goes through at Ravensbrück and on the Death March. And then there's Isabel's reunion with Vianne and their equal acceptance and understanding of each other. And, of course, Isabel's final moments getting to see Gaetan one last time. But the single most heartbreaking stuff for me was actually the ending of Vianne's adopted son Daniel's storyline. Daniel, formerly Ari, and then Ari again in the end. It's such an emotional gut punch because they're finding happiness after the war, and it's so understandable that distant family of Ari's would want him back and him to move to New York with them. But we've, in a way, grown up with Daniel, with Vianne protecting him and us, kind of leading us through that half of the story. And we've all been through this nightmare together. And so to have him ripped away from her and her having no choice, and of course she understands why it's necessary, but it's still so difficult. That part really, really got to me. And that Sophie gifts Daniel, or Ari, her comfort stuffed animal. And then in those last few pages when Ari reconnects with Vianne at the reunion in 1995. In my opinion, that's the most powerful stuff in a book full of well-written, dramatic, and horrific moments. And that should just about do it. If you have any interest in historical fiction set during this time, or interest in specifically what women suffered through at this time, by all means, if you haven't read this book, do yourself a favor and pick it up. If you have read this, I'd love to know your thoughts down below in the comments. As always, thank you all so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.